So welcome, everybody. Welcome, comrades. Thanks very much for joining this evening's discussion organised by Talking About Socialism from a Marxist Point of View. This is one of our regular fortnightly Monday night discussions. We pride ourselves on having a friendly, comradely discussion and debate. We welcome differences, disagreements, questions. In fact, we encourage them. So once we open the discussion to the floor, please don't hesitate to put your hand up and ask, disagree, make a contribution. The way that we organize these discussions is that we have an introduction. Tonight, we've got Will McMahon, who's one of the organizers of Talking About Socialism, has written a number of articles on Ukraine on our website and has led off on previous discussions on Ukraine. He's going to be introducing the discussion, the war in Ukraine 2 years on, trying to give an assessment and posing the political question, as we always do, what should socialists say and do? So after Will's introduced for 15 minutes, we'll then open it up to the floor. And we do it this way. We give everybody 3 minutes, which is timed fairly rigorously. And the reason that we do it that way is so that everybody who wants to speak gets an opportunity to speak. And we normally have time for people to come back in a second, sometimes a third. But we do try to encourage everybody to speak, even if it's just to ask a question. And we always make the point that there are no silly or stupid questions. It's daft to keep stum if you've got a question that you want to ask. So there's been a lot of recent developments in Ukraine, which I'm sure Will is going to touch on over the last few days. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Will to introduce the discussion, and I'll say over to you, Will.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick. I'm basically going to cover 3 areas. I will touch on what's happened over the last couple of days, but I'll cover 3 main areas. The first is to look at the present state of play in military terms. Second is who the winners and losers are from this war. And the third is what might happen next and what should Marxist socialists be calling for. So to look at the present state of play, a year ago, Zelensky was signaling his determination to hold Bakhmut, a city with a pre-war population of 70,000. It was of symbolic value rather than strategic importance at that time, although that's changed now. And he also announced the coming of the spring offensive of the Ukrainian army. Now, between the last quarter of 2022 and April 23, over 60,000 Ukrainian troops were given training in NATO countries in preparation for the spring offensive, in the hope that it would push the Russian army back. NATO countries sent military supplies to support the offensive, and the aim was to split the Russian front in 2 in order to cut the land bridge. And if you looked at what General Petraeus was saying from the United States, they were very confident that they could cut the land bridge to Crimea, and they thought that the offensive would be a success. Almost a year on, without question, the strategy has failed. Bakhmut fell before what turned into the Ukrainian summer offensive, before that got underway in June 2023. 6 months later, in December, there was barely a perceptible movement in the front line of any meaningful nature. Only near Zaporizhzhia did the Ukrainians gain ground, taking the village of Robotny, crossing the Dnieper, holding a very small enclave in a town called Krinky, which has a population of about 1,000. And I think it's very doubtful that either of these gains will be held by the end of March. Some estimates suggest that the Russians actually gained more land in 2023 than the Ukrainian forces.
Will, you've frozen. Will?
Sorry about that. Don't know what happened.
Don't worry. It's one of those things with Zoom. So pick up where you a couple of seconds ago.
Okay, so it's very doubtful if the gains will be held. The Russians gained, it's estimated, more land than the Ukrainian forces, despite them being on active active defense, i.e. not trying to gain land. They destroyed huge amounts of NATO equipment. They killed tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops who were basically cannon fodder of the strategic offensive. Then very recently, we've seen the fall of Avdiivka, a very important place, a city that used to have 30,000 people there, because it was being used by the Ukrainians to bomb the Donetsk. And it fell really, really quickly. The Ukrainian positions collapsed. They were surrounded. They should have withdrawn sooner. It's been a disaster for them. And just underlining all this, since January 2024, there have been over 300 Russian advances across the whole of the front. So it doesn't look good for Ukraine. But from a socialist or communist perspective, who are the losers and who are the winners from these 2 years of frankly pointless carnage? And what we should remember at this point is the tens of thousands that have died had no need to die. Merkel and Macron both sabotaged a deal. And we know that in March 2022, Johnson went specifically to see Zelensky to say, do not accept a deal, do not make peace, we will back you all the way. He prevented a peace deal being made. Now, the losers, the first set of losers are the Ukrainian civilians on both sides of the front line. According to the UN, some 10,000 civilians have died. That's the minimum figure, and twice as many have received injuries of one sort or another. The second set of losers are the several hundred thousand of troops, the dead soldiers, and the many more injured on both sides who have died over the last 2 years. Across Ukraine and across Russia, there are many empty seats at dinner tables of people who should be alive but are now dead because of this pointless war. Self-determination is the third loser for everybody living in Ukraine, both sides of the front line. It's highly unlikely that the annexations of the Russian state will be tested by democratic ballots. It's very unlikely, and I think now that Ukraine will return to its 2022 borders. Fourthly, democracy in Russia is a loser. It's been further weakened under the cover of the war drive. Russia's Supreme Court on Thursday banned the main anti-war candidate, Boris Nadezhdin. He was disqualified. A week later, as we know, Alexei Navalny collapsed and died in the prison, in the penal colony where he's being kept. Now, while neither of these men were friends to the working class, I think, in fact, they were enemies, their fates do represent, I think, a final transition to a managed democracy in Russia, where you have one main party who wins and two or three who contest but don't really challenge. And I think that's a significant shift that we're about to see, if it hasn't happened already. And also, at this point, I think we should mention Boris Kagarlitsky, who has now been jailed for 5 years, a socialist activist and anti-war activist who has suffered at the hands of Putin. Fifth loser is democracy in Ukraine and social policy in Ukraine and the working class in Ukraine. Under the cover of war, there have been attacks on the working class and social gains that they gained. So, for example, Oksana Zolonovich, who's the head of the Ministry of Social Policy in Ukraine, said, quote, "We need to break everything that is social today and simply create a new social contract of social policy in our country from scratch. Many of our citizens are, in a sense," and she actually said this, many of our citizens are, in a sense, teenagers who think the state owes us a duty of a care and assistance, and I won't take my part in my own personal development. I'm not ready to take responsibility. She said, this is a philosophy that we must break, the voice of neoliberalism in the Ukrainian government that is hostile to the working class and hostile to working class politics. There's also been attacks on people who wish to speak Russian and the use of the Russian language. There's been attacks on democratic rights. I mean, and this is just one example. There are many examples I could mention here. But for propaganda purposes, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov at the UN Security Council a couple of weeks ago mentioned the death of somebody called Gonzalo Lira. Now, he was a US-Chilean joint national who did YouTube videos critiquing NATO, much like we would do, critiquing the war, critiquing Zelensky's role. The thing that Gonzalo Lira did was he did these YouTube videos from his home in Kharkiv in the Ukraine. Now, this guy too was not a friend of the working class. I have no time for him. Watched his videos, no time for him. But in essence, he too was allowed to die in prison cell from edema and pneumonia. They just left him to die, basically. And unsurprisingly, the US, of which he was a citizen, has not raised this matter despite his father pressing for an explanation. So those are the losers. The working class have lost in this struggle, I think. But there are some winners, and we should be clear about who they are. First one, I think, is the military-industrial complex, the worldwide bonanza for military industry. The US military-industrial complex made billions from the war, and they've had a US fatality-free testing ground for much of their military equipment. And this is really important to them. It's not often they get time to do real-time military testing of equipment. And the same can be said for the French and Germans. So they've had ability to experiment, to find out how certain levels of equipment work, see how the Russians might respond, how an enemy might respond. And it has to be said, the Russian military-industrial complex has also made massive gains. Their spending has doubled. The role of the Russian military in life has been reinforced. Now, all of these skills could be easily directed to producing technology that could, for example, have been used to meet the environmental crisis. But instead, this technology has been focused on killing people and at the same time adding to the climate crisis. I mean, if any of you looked at the battlefields in Ukraine, there's just an environmental disaster zone, frankly. The other kind of military-industrial complex winners are the North and South Koreans countries that have been really having a competition to see how many shells they could supply to their side of the war. So the North Koreans have been supplying Russia, South Korea have been supplying Ukraine. Second sorts of winners are those who are advocates for a closer union of the European Union, the creation of an integrated military for the European Union. This is something that the EU has been aiming towards for some time. I mean, over the last 3 decades, really, this argument's been going on. I think this war has been an engine for the creation of a European military imperial force, and I think that will gain momentum. The third winner is, of course, Vladimir Putin. He's come out of this hugely strengthened, as has Russia in terms of global power politics. Russia is seen by many as a bulwark against NATO expansionism, and I think this is where this multipolar world analysis comes from. Putin's 71. He's going to be in power now until at least 2030, we think. Another winner, the Russian ruling class. 500 of the richest people in Russia own 2/5 of the financial assets of the country. The evacuation of Western capital from Russia due to the embargo has opened up new areas of investment for them and profitability to the local ruling classes. There isn't much foreign direct investment from Russia globally, so actually it's been a really big gain for them, for the Russian ruling class, and they've definitely benefited from it. And we should also not forget that Ukraine ranks as in the top 10 globally for its stores of iron, manganese, titanium, graphite, uranium. It also has some of the largest coal, oil, and gas reserves in the world. Now, these regions, including Ukraine's section of the Black Sea, are now mainly controlled by Russia and account for about half of Ukraine's conventional oil, 72% of its natural gas, almost its entire coal production and reserves. These are not small matters in Putin's calculations. It represents a huge resource annexation by the Russian state and by the Russian ruling class. And you may not think of it imperialism, you might think of it colonialism. It's certainly capitalist expansionism. Fifth winner is basically the bonanza for the Western multinationals. Paying for the war will cost the Ukrainians any sort of sovereignty, as they will be locked into debt repayment to notional allies and will be subject to asset stripping by NATO powers. It's going to cost around 350 billion. The multinationals will say, before you get the investment, we need peace. They're going to have an arm lock on Ukraine for it to give up land to get investment. I think that's pretty clearly what's coming down the line. Sixth, NATO. Now, I'm cautious about calling it a defeat for NATO, as I don't think they were particularly interested in Ukrainian self-determination in the first place. They've managed to add Finland and Sweden to the NATO countries, and they're going to get a client state in what remains of Ukraine in that area. And in one sense, while they have lost, because it's weakened their global leadership to a degree, I think, the talk of a multipolar world does have some material foundation. It has strengthened the US's role as the leader of one set of imperialist nations via NATO. And it's part of the global NATO project. So they've lost something, but also gained something, I think. China's also a winner, developing trade links with Russia, forming an alliance with Russia, and is emerging as a global challenger to the United States. Oh, and last but not least, there's another winner, and that's Donald Trump, who can now pose as a peace candidate, while his real objective is to break the Russian-Chinese alliance because he sees China as the main enemy. The working class has won nothing from any of this, nothing at all. They are the biggest loser in this contest, in this inter-imperialist rivalry. I think there's no doubt about that. So what next? It looks to me as if the Russians will force through a spring offensive, and they'll force through peace. By doing that, they'll have an arm lock on Ukraine. It looks like the Ukrainian army is in really serious difficulty, and the Russians will force a peace on their terms. NATO has no interest in Ukrainian self-determination and will perhaps want that peace to be accepted in sort of not de facto but not de jure. You might get a Ukrainian type frozen border. NATO will also win because they'll try and further militarize NATO over time and have a client state, and it will it's enabled NATO to increase their war drive. We're in the middle of a new Cold War, as we know, and military spending is going through the roof. So in this context, the working class has suffered a severe defeat, I think. And what should socialists be arguing for? I'll make 6 very brief points. Firstly, a ceasefire. Enough of working class troops killing working class troops. That has to stop. Secondly, Russia should leave Ukraine. There should be no forced annexations, only self-determination. Third, we should be calling for an end for the war drive by NATO across the globe. Fourth, we should call for a cancellation of all the debts that the Ukraine notionally owes to its allies. It shouldn't be the Ukrainian working class should not be paying the price of this war in any way whatsoever. Fifthly, what's required, I think, is a neutral Ukraine between NATO and Russia with guaranteed borders. And sixthly, we should be arguing for as a minimum, these are immediate demands, a return to democratic norms in both countries and the release of all political prisoners.
Wow, Will, that was a tour de force. You managed to cover so much detail and a broad sweep. So I'm going to open it up into a discussion in a minute. I've already got Minnie's hand up. Just because there were some latecomers who didn't hear my opening remarks, what we're going to do now is open it up to the floor. Please indicate by using the yellow raised hand, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if I call you in, you'll have 3 minutes. And please look at the screen. I'll give you a finger like that, which means you've got 1 minute left. So finish that point. And the reason that we keep it to 3 minutes is to try and get as many people into the discussion as possible. So Minnie, I'm going to call you in, and please can I see other people that want to come in as well. Thanks, Minnie.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Just a bit of a joke first. De facto du jour. Whatever. Whatever. I wanted to say thanks for that, Will. I thought that was a really good intro, a good talk. But I don't agree. One thing I don't agree with you on is the testing ground for new equipment, because in my understanding, countries are dumping their old equipment on Ukraine. We've got rid of some depleted uranium that we didn't want at the moment, probably not going to use. Let them poison their country and toxins. Also Challenger tanks. I believe the USA sent a lot of old stuff. And so I think Gaza's more a testing ground for equipment when it comes to the latest arms, unfortunately. All of it's unfortunate. Also, democratic norms. Oh, we know that isn't democracy, don't we? Hey, I was reading for some other group I'm with, I was reading some of this. Imperialism, the higher stage of capitalism by Lenin. And saw, I think really interesting spoke, we're talking about wars and imperialism that he's got here. Let me just find where my dot is. I probably won't be able to find it now. Oh, sorry. I can tell you what, I'll come back in with that after. Yeah, so what I was going to say, right, so 61 billion of aid is currently held up by is it the House of Representatives in the USA. That won't arrive for a year or longer. And they actually will be sending new equipment because they're having to make new stuff. And America's quite low on arms now. They've been giving a lot to Ukraine. Also, they've had billions already. Now, I've heard something like the amount of people that have fled Ukraine, 30 million is it? A lot of those will be fighting age men. I've also heard casualty figures of something like 300,000, 50,000 went in the recent month. Getting the finger already.
I was a bit late, Minnie, actually.
No, yeah, no, I'm joking. I believe that I heard from the Grey Zone reporting that they're sending a lot of, fighting age men. There aren't as many now to draw on. Unfortunately, they've been murdered or had their limbs hacked off. So they're sending Down syndrome to the front, and they're sending a lot of women as well. Capitalist war of resources, obviously. I believe that BlackRock and American, I'm going now, were already in the Donbass and they were they're seeking to get resources. Gosh. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Minnie. Maybe be able to come back in and finish those points. I've got Anthony Cox to be followed by Matthew Jones. So, Anthony, unmute.
All right, I thought that was very interesting talk. In terms of, I mean, I've been following the conflict quite closely, and I would agree if that's what you're saying. I'm not exactly sure if that is what you're saying. That the Russian offensive, the Russian SMO, if you want to use that term, was not an imperialist operation. And I think the expansion of capital that you're talking about is actually a consequence rather than the result of the fundamental reasons. I do believe that Russia was under existential threat. I think if we look at the control, particularly within the State Department, and around the presidency of the neocon wing, or various neocon wings, actually, because the neocons are now a monolith. It's quite clear that they were drawn on the Brzezinski doctrine and all the rest. So probably people are quite well aware of the history of all that. So this was a conflict that was a long time coming. It didn't develop in 2014. It didn't develop in 2024, and it didn't develop in 2014. Developed much prior to that, and it's about the attempt by the US to establish or keep or maintain, hegemony. And what it actually represents, I believe, on the part of US and British imperialism, because Britain's been playing an independent role in this. So people have been presenting them as a poodle with the US, but that is not the case. That does not appear to be the case to me. Looking at it and learning from it. So basically, I mean, I think actually they made a major miscalculation in going on to the SMO, and I believe that this is a major defeat for what's looming here and in the Middle East. Is a major defeat for US imperialism and British imperialism. I believe that this conflict probably will. Obviously, it's up in the air and it's something that we can discuss, but I think myself that the whole basis of the EU is actually being fundamentally challenged, and that the EU is probably on borrowed time. The NATO is actually probably on borrowed time. Again, that obviously can't be, settled in a wee discussion like this, but certainly the trajectory development is that the Western imperialism, the West, so-called Anglophone countries in the EU, who are absolutely under the control of neoliberal and neocon ideas, that's absolutely clear, are dead set, and this is part of the problem. They're under the control, and I'd like you to maybe expand on this, because maybe my time is actually running out. So to actually maybe expand on this whole issue of the position of US imperialism, and how the political fractures at the heart of US imperialism between the neocon and non-neocon, the paleo cons and the realists, and that how this. I think we've actually got to look at this a lot more closely.
To stop, sorry. Okay, thank you very much. I've got Matthew, followed by Ed, followed by Soraya.
Right. Thanks, comrades. No, it's been useful so far. I think the thing about this is this war is actually has to be placed at the door of US imperialism. It is what actually fomented and started this war. If you go back to 2014, which is the key event, and you can go back further than that, but 2014 is the key event in which the Ukrainian government is overthrown by the US and Germany in an operation in which the Victoria Nuland of the State Department estimated the cost of $5 billion over the previous several years to subvert the Ukrainian government. And that operation, of course, was led by fascists and the far right, which is why, of course, the Ukrainian government is so in love with the far right of the Second World War period. So, I mean, I think that the issue really is for socialists is how do we oppose our own imperialists?
Yeah.
And it's the core of this also is what they have done. Of course, is Biden, of course, is deeply personally linked to this whole business. You also see, of course, that one of the things that the US really wanted to do was to break the supply of gas, in particular, and energy from Russia to Europe. Biden said, okay, well, the Nord Stream will not come on stream, it's not going to happen, and then they went and blew it up, which is extraordinary. I mean, it shows how imperialism works. I mean, it's a piece of German capital installation, part owned, Russia and Germany part owned, and of course, neither the Germans won't ask any questions. The people whose territory it was on, the Danes and the Swedes and so on, won't ask any questions, because obviously they know that the Americans don't want those questions asked. So, in those terms, what we're also seeing, of course, is the disintegration of American imperialism. It's caught at this point, because you look at this as a single piece between this and the lunacy of the Israelis in Gaza, a genocide being carried out in public view. I mean, the imperialists have no real objection to mass killing. They love it. But the point being is it's now being done in public view on social media.
Matthew, you've got 30 seconds.
Okay, right. So in those terms, you can see that they can't even get a budget through to pay for this. So the Europeans are now panicking because they understand the only thing they want to prop up the Ukrainian government, and they understand they can't. And they need to militarize their entire society, and they can't. So this crisis is developing, not merely in Ukraine, but the whole of Europe and the US.
Thanks very much. Spot on time. That's great. I've got Ed Potts, followed by Soraya, followed by Chris Strafford. So, Ed.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. And thanks also to Will for an excellent introduction. Will has sketched out quite pessimistic prospects for the Ukrainian ruling class in achieving its war aims as it previously stated them. And I think that's correct. I agree with that. Obviously, it seems ludicrous at this point to suggest that either the war-weary Ukrainian population or indeed the NATO funding will be able to sustain this war up to a point where Ukraine can reconquer the Crimean Peninsula or other territories lost since 2014, which was what Zelensky has previously stated are his war aims. It just seems complete fantasy now, if it ever appeared realistic in the first place. But the point that I'd like to raise and see what Will thinks about it is the question of what Marxists should be advocating in those territories like a rump Ukraine, if that's what will emerge out of this war, and territories like that which are balkanized, for want of a better term, or at risk of balkanization, division along national or ethnic lines which run through the lines of nation states as we've previously understood them. I think in terms of the Ukrainian situation, I mean, I think a full third of the population of Ukraine, as was, used to vote for the now banned Party of Regions, which advocated for things like Russian to become a co-equal official language of Ukraine and for a federal system to replace the system of government. And that kind of question, the so-called national question and linguistic and ethnic identities and national rights continues to pop up all over Europe, doesn't it? From Scotland, Catalonia to regions of Belgium, and indeed still in the Balkans. And it's something that we will see time and time again, and we will continue to see in a rump Ukraine, the regions of Ukraine which have been lost to Russia or remain disputed. And so I just wondered if Will has any thoughts on what we should be advocating in those territories where the pull of national or linguistic or a conjoined identity is very strong and creates deep divisions and can provide and can prove a real barrier to organising along class lines.
Thanks very much, Ed. That's just inside. That's great. I think Soraya's just got a question.
Yeah, it's thanks, Will, for such a comprehensive introduction. Really appreciate it. I always saw this as a war by proxy, as in Western imperialism carrying out its war against Putin by pretending that they was interested in Ukraine and support. I mean, as in the people, whoever they are. Hasn't Western imperialism lost? I'm not quite sure with all the money that they put in, Will, if you can explain how they've done so badly and how Putin is, well, as a result, Putin is greatly strengthened. So what does it mean? Because it seems to me that this is a great setback for the working class. Swathes of workers have been killed, Russian workers, Ukrainian, and democracy has been greatly reduced, what there was. Do we have any idea what's happened to those people who protested against the war in Russia? Yeah, those were just my questions.
Thanks very much. Chris Strafford is next. Chris?
Thanks, Nick. Great introduction, Will. I just wanted to add a couple of comments. I mean, with the Avdiivka catastrophe, I mean, we have thousands and thousands of dead, thousands and thousands of workers dead for what is quite a small town. I mean, the government in Kiev knew months and months ago that the town would fall. But again, as Will pointed out, like Bakhmut, it became a point of pride, a point of honor for Zelensky and his government to keep sending more and more men into the meat grinder there. And I mean, the end result again is exactly the same as what we saw in Bakhmut, where we had thousands and thousands of unnecessary deaths, and then the Ukrainian forces fleeing in disarray, with some still trapped and some surrendering. We don't get told how many Ukrainians are dying, but I think what we can tell from the reports that we get from the front lines is that the army that is currently facing off against Putin is old, much older men. All the young men seem to have been killed or seem to have been wounded or have fled abroad. So you have an army at the front which really should be collecting their pensions and taking it easy, not being thrown into a pointless war. You can see that the generals want to have a new wave of conscription. I think what we will see, especially after what has happened over the last 2-3 weeks, is that the army is becoming more and more restless. There's been protests in recent months by widows and family members of servicemen who have not been rotated out or have been killed at the front. And the West as well obviously has behaved absolutely appallingly. We see Zelensky everybody wanted their picture with him, wanted to go and visit him and whatever. He's reduced to traipsing around the globe begging for ammunition for guns that the NATO powers have sold or given, and begging for money for an economy that really is in dire straits. I think we're absolutely right. The working class has suffered a real defeat with this war. The lack of an independent working class position, both inside Russia and Ukraine of any size, has really damaged any chance to bring an end to this war before hundreds of thousands were killed. And what we've got in Britain and in the West is a rise in militarism. Every week we see generals telling us that we're going to go to war, wanting more money for war and what have you. And I'll wrap it up there, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Spot on. I'm going to call in Sandy now, Sandy McBurney, and he'll be followed by Dan Morgan.
Oh, okay, comrades, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Right. I have a bit of a different position on the matter. First, I think that a central thrust of socialist politics should be the attempt to recreate the Soviet Union, but on a democratic basis, that is, unite the working class of Ukraine and Russia, etc., in the recreation of a planned economy under workers' control. I think that's an important point to put forward. I think the war itself is a war of an imperialist aggression by the US and NATO against Russia. I don't think Russia is an imperialist country. I don't think it would qualify under Lenin's definition. I think what we really have is one imperialist in power in the world, sometimes referred to as either super imperialism or hyper imperialism. That is the USA. And the other imperialist powers like Britain, France, Germany are really under the domination and leadership of the USA. USA calls the shots and has done since the Second World War and the domination of the dollar. And I think the war of aggression arises from the decay of the American economy and the fact that it's been hollowed out and it's now suffering because of finance capital, basically, which is parasitical and doesn't actually engage in productive activity. It just engages financial manipulation. And China is arising as a potential rival. I don't accept China's imperialist either. Obviously, I don't think the working class is in power in China, but I don't think finance capital is in power either. But I think you have to see that context of what we have on a world scale. This could be said to the beginning of World War III. US imperialism is on the warpath. It was used Ukraine, had been using Ukraine for a number of years. And with the coup in 2014, you built up its forces to launch the attack in the hope that they could overthrow Putin, in the hope that they could turn Russia into a semi-colony and return it to the time when Yeltsin was in power. Again, I think you have to look at the Stalinist overthrow of the Soviet Union and what happened after that in order to situate this. The imperialists were not willing to offer the Stalinist bureaucracy a kind of a place within the world system, other than very, very subordinate to the US imperialism. US imperialism doesn't want any rivals. So I disagree that it's been a tremendous blow to the working class. I think that actually the fact that US imperialism is suffering a defeat here is a big boost to the working class throughout the world, particularly in the global south. And I think to some degree, the very fact that the Palestinians have taken on the struggle that they have at the moment is partly because people can see that the US isn't the world power it was. Last point, if you're going to have socialism, the main enemy is US empire. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. That's great. Just on time. Dan Morgan, please. Well, welcome, Dan. I don't think we've seen you before. Hope you're enjoying
No, I
it.
don't think so. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with some of those points. I'd like to point up the mention of the multipolar world, which was given us, mentioned as a sort of throwaway phrase, but I think this is the key to what has been happening. The US imperialism sees China as a big competitor, as its major threat to its world domination. It's had world domination since 1991. You see what they did in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, whatever, Western imperialism in general. The USA and Britain as its usually faithful lapdog. Now, people in Britain, may be used to this situation, but I live in Latin America. And for Latin America, it's hugely important that US imperialism is defeated in terms of its domination, in terms of its ability to browbeat, control, impose sanctions. Remember, the USA has sanctions involving 40% of the world's population. They try to impose their will wherever they can. In Latin America, we know all too well with coups in this century, not only in the past century. And for the USA, the alliance of Russia and China is an even bigger threat than just China by itself. Mm-hmm. Since 28, in fact, when the decision was taken to bring Ukraine into NATO in principle, since 2014, the armed conflict has been ongoing in Ukraine. And the main aim has been to provoke Russia into war in order to weaken it. And as the previous comrade said, to try and get rid of Putin, establish a friendly regime there. This, to me, is the main contradiction involved. And the fact that they have not succeeded, that Russia is not weaker, but in fact, in some respects, at least stronger, is a real defeat for US imperialism. It doesn't mean advance to socialism immediately, but the fact that countries will be able to determine their politics independently and get away from the domination, overcome the domination of US imperialism, is a huge factor for the development of world politics.
Thanks very much, Dan. I'm going to chair myself in, and I've only got 3 minutes, so I'm going to be brief and to the point, hoping to sort of stimulate another round. So I have to say that I agree with some of the points that have been raised by a number of the speakers, including Sandy, in terms of how the war started. And I agree with the fear of the threat to American hegemony is what led America to provoke Russia successfully, as it transpires, into the war. But it's not been spelled out categorically, but what I'm gleaning from what's behind some of the comments is that somehow we should take the side of Russia, that somehow in World War III we should take the side of China, that somehow that what emerges from a defeat of American imperialism, which I support, is independence of countries which somehow will not be oppressed by a new hegemon. If the working class internationally is absent from the struggle, if the international working class does not impose itself on the situation, and insofar as Ukraine is concerned, I don't see that that has been the situation at all. It's different with regards to Gaza, where there have been mass protests. But victory, I agree that the main enemy is at home, and we should oppose any attempt by British imperialism to advance its position. But for me, the misunderstanding of that socialist Marxist slogan, and it's a misunderstanding of Lenin, in my opinion, to suggest that in the present circumstances, the working class should somehow support Russia, which means supporting the Russian leadership, which means supporting the Russian oligarchy and Putin. And a victory for Russia in Ukraine will not mean the liberation or a move to a more democratic society. It will strengthen the dictatorship of Putin. So what's the answer? The answer, yes, we can campaign for more democracy, more democratic demands, but however difficult it appears, we have, as socialists, maybe a minority in the world, we have the obligation to raise the question of independent thought, independent program of the working class, explaining that our class is the only class that has got the answer. And it doesn't mean the creation of democratic bourgeois states. It's fighting for the socialist transformation of society, the communist transformation of society with the working class in power and the abolition of capitalist property relations. So yeah, that's been a bit to the point, but I thought it was necessary. Thanks. So I've got, I'm going to call Will in to deal with this round of questions, and then we're going to open it up again, and I'll be starting again with Minnie.
Right. Okay. I'll be quick because I can see people want to contribute, and that's a good thing, and I don't want to take up too much space. I think basically to pick up I'm going to pick up various points as I go along. I do think the Western militarism is testing out equipment. I think they're testing out Abraham tanks. I think they're testing out different kinds of guidance control systems, and some of it is new that they hope the Russians won't be able to capture. But I do accept that they've been sending them some crap as well, to be honest. That especially European powers have been sending rubbish over. They've been getting rid of old stock and saying, I hope that'll do. I think in terms of numbers, Minnie, 8 million have left Ukraine, and quite a lot of young people have left, quite a lot of young men have left Ukraine because they didn't want to be rounded up. And the average age of the troops now in the Ukrainian army is 40, which is a shocking stat, really. So I think those things. In terms of, I agree that we are living in a multipolar world. But the thing is, we've got to decide what kind of multipolar world is that and which class is in charge. And unfortunately, I don't see the working class in charge in 99%. One could argue about Cuba. I'm sure we'd have a very interesting discussion, but I don't see working class states challenging US power in this multipolarity. I agree the US is on a downward course and it's desperately trying to maintain its dominance and hegemony across the world. But that to me is a signal of an inter-imperialist conflict. I think that's what we're facing. In terms of advocacy, what we should advocate, I think the question of self-determination, the question of all these kind of the linguistic differences, the movement of peoples across Eastern Europe is a really complex question. In principle, we're in favor of self-determination, yeah, and we should support that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we support self-determination. We think people should have the right to vote, in my view, but I wouldn't be in favor of fragmentation. What's really concerning, in a way, is the kind of legacy of the Soviet Union with the Russian-speaking peoples scattered in what are non-Russian states now. And we have to find some kind of resolution to that crisis that is based on a socialist perspective and a democratic perspective, rather than by the force of arms. And it's a debate that needs to be had. And I'm not sure I know what the answer to it is, Ed. I wish I did. NATO, I think, totally underestimated Russia, completely underestimated it, and forgot that, you know, when you start a war, which is what I think NATO did actually, when you start a war, then you can never be certain of what the outcome is. And in terms of the Ukrainians, anyway, the outcome I think has certainly been disastrous. In terms of once again, in terms of the multipolar world, I think you have to ask yourself, what is the character of the Chinese state? I think that's something that we need to have a debate about and a discussion about, because I don't think now there is anything socialist about the Chinese state. I wish I could say there were. I think it's just a classic version of an elite doing state-centered accumulation. And I completely understand, in historical terms, the Chinese elite ruling class, whatever you want to call them, because, you know, their kind of hostility towards the United States and Western powers, because they chomped China up, they divided it up. Western imperialism in China was a social disaster of just huge proportions. And I think you have to see a lot of what's going on in terms of the Chinese attitude through that history, which was completely disastrous. I could go on, but I just think that there are many contradictions in this situation. I do think NATO has made gains, actually. I think Finland's a gain, I think Sweden's a gain, and I think the Ukraine's a gain. So it's not all bad from their point of view. I don't think they've been defeated. I just think they've underestimated Russia, and the victim of this underestimation is the Ukrainian working class.
Thanks, Will. I'm going to open it up for another round, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't spoken, put your hand up, please, even if it's just to ask a question like a couple that we've had so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Minnie, I'm going to call back in Anthony Cox, I'm going to call in Soraya, and I'm going to call in Matthew, and then Chris Strafford. So we're all already getting a full list, so please do put your hand up. So Minnie, and everybody, can I just appeal to please stop when I put my hand up? Oh, that's what I'm going to do. When I do that, you've got basically 5 or 10 seconds. Otherwise, it's not fair on the people that follow. Okay, thanks. Minnie.
Right, yeah, Lenin. What he said was the First World War, the tens of millions of dead and maimed are left by a war to decide whether the British or German group of financial plunderers is to receive the most booty. And then he talked about the peace treaties that people could see through, the working class could see through, that was going to wise them up and lead to revolution. But this didn't happen. He did say, thus out of universal ruin caused by the war, a worldwide revolutionary crisis is arising, which, however prolonged and arduous its stages may be, and goodness me, has it been prolonged and arduous, and it still is. Now, it's my understanding, I think in the end, that what's going to be, there's going to be a further carve-up, which happens at the end of a lot of wars. That this time, it's my understanding that the American corporations were already in the Donbass before Russia went in. That's why they went into Ukraine, as well as to provoke, as well as to get at Russia. So there's going to be a carve-up. I think there will be a peace treaty, another peace treaty, a peace agreement, and that Russia will probably take the Donbass, and the USA. Zelensky's already sold a lot of the land to the USA, and Western powers are going to be in there making money. Now, Lenin also spoke about imperialism by other means. People were talking about China. It's my understanding that China's building infrastructure in a lot of countries, including railways, etc. So that's imperialism by other means. Somebody mentioned that surrendering. It's also my understanding that the Russian army has it's allowing a lot of the Ukrainians to surrender rather than kill them, because they consider them to be fellow Orthodox Church and all that. Also, this with Gaza as well going on, with Gaza as well going on, you've got USA is still in Syria, and it's in Syria. It's not supposed to be there, but it is, and it's got the oil fields, and also it's put loads of sanctions on the Syrian people, and they're hungry, and then they're occupying the wheat fields, the Americans, so that the Syrians can't get food. I mean, this is just shocking. I'm not sure what that means, Nick. Is that 5?
Make your last point.
Okay. That's it.
Great. Thanks, Minnie. Anthony.
All right. Just respond to a couple of the points that Will made in his summing up of the first round of discussion. I mean, this idea that there's a suggestion people are supporting Russia, I'm assuming that's aimed at myself because of the comments I made initially. Nobody said that. Nobody said I don't support Putin. I don't support the Russian military-industrial complex. But I believe, as a socialist, my first duty is to basically attack my own bourgeois and actually call this out as an imperialist conflict. I do not believe that Russia is an imperialist country, and neither do I believe that about China. That doesn't mean to say that that process cannot develop further down the road. That brings me on to the point that I'm quite concerned about, and it's about the political consequences in Europe and beyond of this conflict. And the thing is, there's many other points I'd like to make, but the thing is that in terms of the economic consequences, but we'll concentrate on the political. Europe is bankrupt now. You know, we cannot. We're being basically Europe is actually being turned into an American colony. America has benefited to a certain extent from the conflict through the transfer of industry increasingly from Germany and Europe towards the US, and also through the increased sales of LNG and other things. So we, you know, what we are actually seeing was we're set through defeat. We will set the seal or set the track towards, we'll be on the track towards conflict within the Western Bloc itself, between the ruling classes in the Western blocs. The European ruling class, such as it is, are coming under immense pressure. And my own feeling, and I'd like to find out what other people think, because there's a lot of people that think along the same lines as myself, I suspect, is where is the political challenge going to come? We've got a fundamental lack of the subjective factor at this stage within Europe. Kind of bit too much on that, because the subjective factor can grow very, very quickly. We've seen that in other historical situations. But in my reckoning, looking at it just on the basis of what's been developing, I cannot see a political challenge coming from anywhere other than the nationalist right and potentially even the fascist right towards neoliberalism within Europe and the USA. And we're going to see, if not a move towards fascism, we're certainly going to see as a major attack on neoliberalism. It's not going to come from the trade unions or the labour movement, because a lot of them have settled into being the left-wing imperialism. It's going to come from the right, the nationalist right, and even the fascist right.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, so next I've got Soraya.
Thanks. Just very briefly, I don't think I can't remember who said it, but I don't think we're in a positive situation for the working class internationally. I don't think there is a worker state in Russia or China. The Russian Revolution, sadly, was very short-lived, or there was a degeneration because of isolation and so many other factors. So I think I felt when forgive me if I can't remember who it was that spoke, but I felt, and I'm not saying actually it wasn't Tony, I was thinking of somebody else. I think the idea that we support Russia or China because in some way they are representing the workers with some sort of state that was under workers' control is just it isn't the reality. And we can have a discussion about what you want to call those states, but they are for me in fact that they are capitalist, and they have you have an elite who controls the means of production and distribution and production, and you do not have any remnants of any workers' control. I'm not convinced that there ever was socialism, which for me means that the working class controls society and runs society. That was very short-lived in Russia, but at least it happened. But I don't think it did in China.
Thanks, Soraya. I'm going to call in now Matthew.
Right, okay,
Got 3 minutes, so I'm going to...
Yeah, all right, okay. So really brief. I think the point being is that first of all, China is not a worker state quite clearly, but it's not capitalist either. It's not fully capitalist. It's actually controlled by the state bureaucracy. It's quite clear, and that maintains a control over both the nature of industry and how it works, and finance itself, and quite clearly allows that to operate in the way it does. Further debate on that needs to be had. Basically Russia is run by gangsters and looters. It's not certainly not imperialist. It just doesn't function to that level. It's basically loot. The Russians actually wanted a deal. I mean, they still they wanted a deal all the way through. The point was actually, of course, if you look at the history of it again, you see the Minsk agreements, of course, were done as Angela Merkel herself confessed, as a means of prolonging the whole process, so they wind up so they could organise for war. The imperialists were quite clear. They wanted a war, and they wanted to hold everything off until they were ready. So I mean that's you can see quite clearly the nature of that. In technical terms, I mean the point of technical terms here, of course, is that Russia, this war is different from all the others. Because if you look at all the other imperialist wars which have been fought recently in Iraq and so on and so forth, they've all been done on the basis of existing stocks. They've been relatively brief. This is a prolonged war. This is 2 years. Basically, what the Americans and the Europeans have done is unload all their old stock, of weapons. If you look at all the tanks and so on and so forth, they've sent all the oldest stuff they've got, stuff out of mothballs. They've cleared out all their stock of shells, in some cases very old, dangerously old. And the thing is that because of the nature of the organisation of capital, obviously they don't have the manufacturing capacity to actually sustain a long war, even one like this. Now, the other thing, of course, about this is it as actually part of the stage, as far as the Americans are concerned and the Russians are concerned, towards the Germans are concerned towards a wider war. Now, the Germans are saying they want to organise in the next few years, over the period, militarisation of society and a wider war against Russia. The Americans have said, right, okay, well, our real war is against China. We want a world war against China. We've already got American generals in charge of serious brigades of the Air Force and so on and so forth, saying to their subordinates, look, get yourselves organised. You may be killed in this war we're organising in the next few years. This is where it's at.
That's
okay,
it.
thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. That's great. I'm going to call in Dan Morgan, and then I'm going to call in Chris.
Okay, quickly. I think we should have a major discussion about China. I'll just make the point that there are certainly capitalists and billionaires in China, but they do not rule the state. The Communist Party, and that's a question of what the character of that is. It's a Communist Party who controls the state. The point is, on the world stage, they do not apply sanctions to any country. They help economic development of countries of all kinds. Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, any country with a progressive direction, they are not applying pressure against them, political pressure. This is what opens up the room for advance to socialism by the working class in any country across the world. And that is why we should support them, China, and its alliance with Russia against US and Western imperialism.
Thanks very much, Dan. That was very concise. Chris.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I'd definitely like to associate myself with comments made by Nick, Soraya, and Will that we've had in this discussion so far. I think what is often lost in this discussion when we're all looking at maps and we're all talking about US grand strategy, the decline, the very real decline of US power, and its attempts to stem that decline is the working class. The idea that the working class can exist as an independent political actor on the world stage, and that is exactly what we are seeing in the catastrophe that is taking place in Ukraine. For the working class of Ukraine, for Russia, nothing has really been gained. I mean, cheering along a conscript army with machine guns at its back, does not sound like a particularly pro-working class, let alone communist or socialist position. The Russian people have been forced into this war. They have been sending thousands of their sons to horrible deaths, to horrible conditions, and further weakening of any kind of democratic or civil society in Russia. I'd also like to question the idea that that what is taking place and the defeat of Ukraine would be a boost for the working class. What has happened over the last 2 years? More war, more poverty, hundreds of thousands dead. Does not seem like much of a win there. I would ask these comrades, like, where are the working class any stronger today because of this? Nowhere. Yeah. The idea that we would favour the Russian gangster state in this war is obviously nonsense, in the same sense that we would not support the jihadist rats in Syria in their wars either. What we desperately needed more than ever is an independent working class position, independent working class organisation that can make the case quite clearly, because the issue at the front that we would say is that the Russian soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers don't have a quarrel with each other. What they need to do, and what communists should be arguing for, is for those armies to go back to Kiev, go back to Moscow and settle accounts there. We should not be cheering along their slaughter. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm going to call in Steve. Steve hasn't spoken this evening, so I'm going to ask Steve to come in now.
Thanks, Nick. Good discussion. Thank you, Will. I just want to make two very brief points, really. I think the first one to make is it's very easy for us to sit here, not easy, but it's one of the things that we can do is to sit here and look at the world in the working class in a static way, that it doesn't look possible, that it looks potentially it's a defeat for the Ukrainian working class. It's the Russian working class. They're unable to even just say to a certain degree, Russian middle class or working class or whatever, even lay a candle in the snow for Navalny. So that's what it looks like on the surface. But, if we remember in January 1917, Lenin spoke to the Swiss young socialists and said he wouldn't see the revolution in his lifetime. 3 or 4 weeks later, him and Parvus were walking past the newspaper stand, and there was a poster that said the Russian autocracy had fallen within 5 days. Out of the blue. So we really don't know the circumstances on the ground that's affecting the working class in Kiev, in the Ukraine, in Russia, even in other countries that we've discussed. I mean, China has mass armed protests. Even The Economist reports mass armed protests in China. How we don't really know what is exactly on the ground here, and anything like this could spill at any moment, and we could be taken by surprise. And I think the important thing for us as socialists is to ensure that we're not taken by surprise, and that I'm not saying anyone here isn't, but we maintain a faith in the working class to rebel, to fight back. And these movements could possibly come almost seemingly from nowhere, as was Paris 1968, for example. And my final point, which I think perhaps we haven't really spoken too much about, but I thought was an important one that Will made, was this is, okay, I'm taking the Minis point that we have given them a load of rubbish, but we've also given them some quite new strategic arms.
Yeah.
And I saw the interview with Petraeus, where they had basically, America and the NATO had trained the Ukrainian army to smash through. They thought it was going to be a very easy process to smash through the Russian lines and make their way to Crimea. And if a proxy army, American-backed proxy army, can't do this to break through the Russian lines in the way that Petraeus thought they could, because he was likening the Russian soldiers to the soldiers in Iraq in 2003. If they can't do it there, and by the way, they don't seem capable of doing it to the Houthis either, who don't seem at all scared by American power, I think that proves that we do have a weakness of US imperialism. And I wasn't even going to talk tonight, but I could go on and on. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to time us back in again, and then I'm going to call Will back in to respond to what's been an excellent discussion. And I hope everybody thinks we've given fair time to everybody to present different points of view, some of which I'm going to try and take up. First of all, I agree with the comrades that say we need more in-depth discussion about all sorts of things. One is, what's the class nature of China? For me, it's a capitalist state run by a capitalist class, and it's a society in which you have capitalist accumulation. There's nothing progressive about China. There's nothing progressive about the nature of the state and its leadership in Russia. What we have at the moment, given the weakness of Marxism internationally, is workers in different parts of the world, including in what's called the Polar South, but also in Africa and elsewhere, looking to China and in some cases to Russia as an alternative to American imperialism. In my opinion, it's our job as Marxists to scotch that. We will never succeed if workers have illusions in the ability of a better life under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party or Putin or Wagner. It's a non-starter, and that's the situation that we face at the moment. We have a weakness of international Marxism. We have a weakness of mass communist parties to chart a way forward. It's absolutely right, as Steve says, that we don't know fully, particularly because of that last point, the absence of a working class international, what's going on underneath the surface. But even if there was a rapid rise in consciousness without a party being predicated, prevalent and established in the working class, in my opinion, the chances of revolution are very, very slim. The Bolsheviks were a mass party, and that's why they were able to be successful. I just want to take, you see, when I came in, I was actually deliberately being a little bit provocative, because I'm not sure that Tony, or Anthony rather, was, but certainly I disagree with Sandy, and Sandy's repeated some of the points in the chat, which I think are fundamentally mistaken, because everybody here agrees that Britain is a gangster state. And you could say that America's a bigger gangster state, and you might say, well, Belgium's a lesser gangster state. But that's not the way, in my opinion, that Marxists should approach the coming world war. The coming world war is about which state, which country or group of countries is going to take the place of American hegemony and divide up the world in a different way, a different imperialist order. And that's not what we want to see at all. We have to impose the will, the action of the working class, however difficult it might seem at the moment. And we've got to say no side. Otherwise, if we take Sandy's point, we'd be backing Belgium against Britain. We'd be backing Britain against America. You might see that the logical position in the Ukraine would be to take the position of Ukraine against Russia, which is not a position that I take, and I'm not suggesting that anybody here does. I'm just trying to point out the illogicality of that position. The world is imperialist, and we have to look at that and to see that the only answer is through working class transformation of society. Will.
Okay. I will try and take up some of the points, and I'll keep it brief. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I really welcome the debate and the difference and the good argument that we're having about this, because it does raise a lot of really important questions that we've got to get our heads around. And I think to pick up Nick's point, I think it's really important that we are focused on the development of a mass socialist party and communist party in this country. It's really, really important because we don't have one. And that would give a working class perspective on this issue, and it could fight in a mass way to change consciousness in this country. And I think that's on the order globally, because with the best will in the world, I can't see working class power in China, in the leadership of the Chinese state. And I can't see working class power in the leadership of the Russian state. I can see major global powers involved in a struggle of resources against a declining US imperial power. That's basically what I see. At the best with China, I'd look at state capitalism, state-centered accumulation, state capitalism. But I think we need to discuss this. I'd love to have a discussion about China, its content, class structure, all that kind of stuff. We have to have that discussion. I take Steve's point about the subjective factor. You can never tell, and Lenin's letter is one of the things that has always kept me going, even in the darkest moments. That you can fundamentally misunderstand what's going on subjectively at class basis, especially if you're a long way away. Yeah. So I really, really take that point, and I think it's a really important point that the subjective factor is crucial. I mean, this was also raised by, I think it was Tony, about Europe, and Tony, about, it's not advertising myself, but about 3 months ago, I gave a talk on the rise of the far right in Europe, and I agree with you. I mean, I think the European Union elections that are coming up in June are going to be pivotal. There's no question about it. I think if you look over the last 10 years, a far-right bloc has emerged and is growing ever more powerful. And as we know, is now running some countries. I don't think it's fascism at the moment, but I do think there's a form of authoritarian right-wing government coming down the line. And it is incredibly worrying, because I think that the far right are ahead of us on the subjective factor, and they're doing better than we would do, and we need urgently to find a political response to that doesn't involve this kind of failed broad party strategy, which doesn't have a class dimension, and I think has failed on many occasions to deliver anything at all. In fact, all occasions. But I agree that's a big problem. And I also agree with the comment that was made that, and perhaps because I started from the military situation and then worked out through what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, I omitted to say, and I should have said actually, that our first duty of course is to attack the warmongering of our own state and our own gangster state. There's no question about that in my mind. That's where our main responsibility lies. But it also lies in making international connections with other Marxists and socialists who are opposed to the war drive in Western Europe and NATO, but also opposed to the governments in Ukraine and in Russia. Russia, the democracy is being shut down in Russia. There's no question about it. Anti-war protesters are being dragged off the streets. There's all sorts of very bad things going on there. And I don't think that, a victory for Putin in a war would be a victory for the working class. I don't. I think it would be a defeat, and that's just how I see it. With regard to the ordering of events, this war clearly started because NATO promised not to move east, then moved east, then said in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, we're going to invite Ukraine into NATO. and that was there's a red line crossed. Yeah. And it seemed to me from that moment on, the die was cast in a way. If they proceeded to move forward, then Putin, in his own power interest, was going to respond. But I have to say, I do think there is an element of a resource war in this, because the Russian state has occupied Ukrainian land with huge amounts of resources on it, And I cannot see that the Russian state is going to go, okay, you have it back, because it wants those resources. And that, for me, is a form of colonialism. I think this war is an inter-imperialist war, because I think it presages, it's part of an inter-imperialist conflict between the United States and China. And I just don't think one can simply say that because Russia was provoked into war, it's then not going to take advantage of the material conquests that it might make. It's certainly not going to give the people of Donetsk, Luhansk, and the other regions a vote on self-determination. That ain't going to happen. We can be absolutely certain. So it's forced annexation. And as far as I'm concerned, we have, as Marxists, have always been against forced annexation. First World War, Second World War, always against it, and we should oppose it now. I do think also that the United States has used this war to put enormous pressure on the European Union. But I think in a strange way, this is going to backfire on them, because I think that France and Germany signing arms deals with the Ukraine and arms supplies to Ukraine, as they did this week and through the Munich Security Conference, they are signaling that they want a unified European military structure. And that isn't a military structure that is going to be solely aimed at the East. It's also to defend the European Union's material capitalist and imperialist interests against the United States as well. That's, I think, part of the coming world that we're going to see. I think I'm just looking at anything else that people raised. I think we've set up some future discussions, the multipolar world and China. It's a good one. And I think we need to have a discussion about the outcome of the European elections. And I also think we need probably to have a discussion about Britain's role as an imperialist power post-Brexit. Be a really, really interesting discussion for us to have, and I think we should have them. But I'd just like to thank everybody for their contributions. It's been fantastic to hear the contributions and to have the discussion and the arguments. It's been great.
Thank you very much, Will. I want to thank everybody, echo Will's points. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along and for everybody who contributed for what they said. It made for a very good discussion. I hope people thought that the discussion was open. I know it's frustrating when you get closed down, so apologies for that, but it did mean that people were able to come in for a second or even a third time, and it did mean that people that might otherwise not have spoken did so. In the chat, which we save, there's loads and loads of points that have come up for future discussions, and we'll be discussing that. And if you've got suggestions for future meetings, please send them in. You'll find our details by filling in a form on our website on the About page, where you'll also see the statement that we've written, which sets out what we're about. And we'll mention this. One of our main points is that we believe and we want to participate with others in the formation of the core of what would become a mass socialist or communist party. You can choose your terminology there. We believe that that's what's lacking in Britain. That's what's lacking in every single country in the world. And we want to do our small bit with others to help rectify that. We can only do that by creating a forum, a space to have debates and discussions like this, to try and clarify ideas, have disagreement, and sometimes perhaps sharp differences. But that's what we need to do to try to work out how we develop. And it's great to see so many new people, including from, if I understood, Dan, from Southern America. So that's great, and I hope everybody comes back. The next discussion that we have, which is in a fortnight time, the 4th of March, 7:30 to 9, it's what should socialists do in the general election in Britain in 2024, as perhaps a bit more prosaic, a bit more practical, but actually it poses really serious, important questions. How do communists make their mark? How do communists advance their program? What's the role of elections in doing that? These are questions that don't just apply to Britain, but everywhere, in our opinion. So we look forward to seeing you all there. If you've got particular comments, have a look at our website, find a place to write them, find our Facebook page, write up your comments there. We like to hear what we're getting right, what we're doing wrong, different point of view. This is a comradely space for discussing Marxism and how we advance it. And with that, I'd like to thank you all again and say good night and see you in a fortnight. Tell your friends and family to come along with you. Good night.